So the kind of anthropologist I am is an ethnographer. I study living people. When I discovered anthropology, I was in high school. I read a book by Margaret Mead, who was a very famous anthropologist back in the day, and I just loved it. I loved the idea of being in a field that looked at people and what people do and what people find meaningful. Margaret Mead was the start of my interest. And then when I was an undergraduate at the University of Michigan, I discovered Zora Neale Hurston, who was probably the first Black female anthropologist and a fantastic writer. And so she was also one of the first anthropologists who looked at the US versus outside the US. But she did her research on the Black communities in the American South and wrote about them as an anthropologist. But she also wrote fiction too. So, Their Eyes Were Watching God and lots of other books. And I love that she had that creativity, that she could write about science and she could also write about fiction. So that's how I got started. I did my graduate work at the University of California, Berkeley on medical related topics. Like my dissertation research was done in Jamaica. I would say that my career pretty quickly branched off from traditional anthropology. So I was at the University of California, San Francisco, which is a medical school, health sciences campus, for a few years, doing research and writing. But then the branching off is when I went into philanthropy, and I worked for the San Francisco Foundation. When I left that foundation, I worked for another one called the Hewlett Foundation, which was started by Bill Hewlett of Hewlett Packard, which was actually an international foundation. So I went from just working in the Bay Area to actually making grants in numerous countries around the world. I worked at the US State Department, still in the field of family planning and reproductive health, and then made another big move to the National Academy of Sciences, which was kind of like going back to being an academic, because you're working on the science end, but you're communicating science to policymakers. And I think the thread that you can see is working on policy is like being at a foundation, in the sense that you're working with people who are trying to make changes. You're trying to make this a better country. So I had been doing genealogy on my mother's family, and I also grew up with the stories that my mother told me about her mother and her grandmother and her great-great-grandmother. When I was like a teenager, my mother would periodically go back to what we call the homestead. She was gradually kind of moving these archives from her mother's house, from Emma's house, to our house. So when my mother passed away 20 years ago, actually, I was going through her trunk maybe the following year, and I found this kind of cardboard album in my mother's trunk. And here's this, oh, this looks interesting. Oh, look at these postcards. Gee, these postcards sure are beautiful. And that's really where it started. Like, they were carefully preserved. The album had not been opened, clearly. So the colors were beautiful, as you can see in the book. The colors were beautiful. They were in good shape. Here I had this opportunity, because it was like a collection, that, I could actually follow the postcards like chronologically. And I recognized some of the names of people who were sending them, to my grandmother, but I didn't recognize where she was. Like, you could see she was like moving around, because the cards would say like care of so-and-so, care of so-and-so. So I'm like, what's going on there? Why is it care of so-and-so? And I think I probably just kind of meditated on that for a few years, like take the postcards out periodically, almost like a tarot cards or something, look at them, look at the front, look at the images, look at the back. And I had been doing family genealogy anyway. So I'll back up for a moment and just say that my mother's family has been living in Pennsylvania. Now it's like 200 years, basically. And so they were free Black. Emma was descended from these free Black families, where because they had been living in one place, and because that place was in the North, it was not too hard to do genealogical research on them. It still isn't easy, but it's easier than if you're dealing with people who were emancipated, after 1860, because I was already interested in the history of the family and these stories. And so I think that's how I started thinking, well, maybe there's a story here with these postcards. I'm not sure what the story is, but it was like they were kind of talking to me and saying, tell our story, tell a story about us. And as I was saying earlier, because I had wanted to take my research skills and do something personal and really make a personal statement. So instead of just writing about data, which I had been doing for years, the data tell us this, the data tell us that, but actually to be talking about something that was personal, which is much more scary, but I wanted to do that. And I thought, well, maybe the postcards are the way to do that, to tell the story, use the postcards to talk about these people that I grew up hearing about and on whom I've been doing research anyway. Can I bring these things all together? And it took years, really, of I look back at my early drafts because I didn't want to make it just about my grandmother. I thought, she's not a famous person. I don't know if anybody would be interested. But actually, I was wrong about that, because people have told me they like the fact that she's not famous. She could be anybody's grandmother in that respect. And she is, in a way. It's like she reflects all of the young Black women who were doing domestic service that nobody paid any attention to, in a way. And we're just lucky that in her case, because she was a saver, that she saved these postcards. And that enables us to tell her story, but it's her story, but it's like a lot of young women's stories